Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. He comes to us from the UK. His name is Andrew Lownie, and we talked back in October about a book that was an excellent book, very fascinating book, titled Traitor King, The Scandalous Exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. But today we're going to talk about a book that was published here in the States in September of 2021. Title of it is The Mountbattens, The Lives and Loves of Dickie and Edwina Mountbatten. And it already has 1,000 5-star ratings. So I think this is a bestseller. And I think I mentioned that in our last discussion. Mr. Lownie's also published the Edinburgh Literary Companion in 2020, Stalin's Englishman, Guy Burgess, The Cold War and the Cambridge Spy Ring in 2016, and John Buchan, The Presbyterian Cavalier in 2002. And he has a long background. I mean, you can go back and listen to the other interview I've done, but Mr. Lownie was educated at Magdalen College in Cambridge, where he was president of the Union and Dunster History Prizeman, and he was awarded his doctorate at Edinburgh University. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and has been a visiting fellow at Churchill College, Cambridge, and senior research fellow in modern British history at the University of Buckingham. But again, we're going to talk about this really fascinating book. I learned a lot about these two very fascinating characters, the Mountbattens. Again, the title of the book is The Mountbattens, The Lives and Loves of Dickie and Edwina Mountbatten. So Andrew Lownie, welcome back to the show. Thanks for coming back.
Well, not at all. Delighted to be talking to you again.
Great. So for people who may not know of your background, can you talk about what got you interested in the Mountbattens and what led you to write this book?
Yes, it sort of came directly from my biography of Guy Burgess, the Cambridge Spy Ring spy. He'd been at the same prep school as Lord Mountbatten, Locust Park, and I read a biography of Lord Mountbatten and realized that he was a fascinating character, but there hadn't been a good biography of him. There'd been one official biography, which I felt didn't really get to grips with his character. And what I wanted to do in the book was to present a portrait of a marriage, because here was a very unusual story. We had two very public figures, particularly in their public roles. He was the last Viceroy of India, and she came as his vicereine. But they had a very complex private life. They both had a series of lovers. They were both bisexual. And it was trying to mold, in a sense, the public image that they had and the private life together. And they are extraordinary. They more or less eclipsed the whole of the 20th century. And they were pretty much at all the major events. He was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, her last godchild. And his, for example, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was married to his aunt. He grew up with the Russian royal family, the ones who perished during the First World War. And he then eventually ended up as the Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia during the war, working with Americans like Joe Stilwell. He knew everyone, all the presidents from Roosevelt onwards. And then he became the last Viceroy. He became Chief of Defense Staff here and First Sea Lord. And she had a very interesting trajectory as well, because she was probably the richest heiress in the world when they married in 1922. She, as I say, took on these lovers, probably about 16 or 17 lovers in the course of their marriage. But then she sort of found herself during the Second World War as this great humanitarian and did a lot of work, first of all, during the war with refugees and prisoners of war, and then later with Save the Children and St. John Ambulance around the world. So they are a very impressive couple. Together with that, he was the uncle of Prince Philip. He was very much a power behind the throne with the Queen, the great mentor to Prince Charles. He was very close to the Queen's father, King George VI, and he was the best man to King Edward VIII. So he was really involved with the royal family and an important figure in influencing their decisions, really, during the 20th century.
Yeah, it's really remarkable that he's there involved. And his family was the Battenbergs before they became the Mountbattens after World War I, because of not being interested in having such Germanic names, much like Saxe-Coburg Gotha too, right?
That's right. His father, in fact, had been First Sea Lord before he did. I mean, that was one of his great ambitions. But he was a German prince Because of the anti-German feeling during the First World War, the family were forced to change their name. And so Mountbatten is just another version, I suppose, of Battenberg. They were going to be called Oldcastle, which they thought sounded a bit like a brewery. But he remained in touch with his German cousins, and that was a very important part of his life. The family homes at Wolfsgarten and Darmstadt.
Right. So both very well traveled, her particularly, but it was interesting because she was much more wealthy than he was. I think you mentioned at the time when they got married, she was worth just an exorbitant amount of money, right?
Yes, I mean it was a very unequal marriage in that respect. He had a very good pedigree, but he was very poor, and there were concerns that he was just a gold digger. But I think it was a genuine love match, an unusual one. But they were devoted to each other, even though they, in a sense, had to have these separate private lives, and. Her wealth allowed him really to promote his career in the Navy. It allowed him to have polo ponies and for them to live extremely well, to entertain very extravagantly. And as you say, she traveled enormously, and often just with one other person camping in the desert. She traveled, was one of the first women to go down the China Road in 1938. She crossed the South Seas on a junk. She camped out in the Middle East. She rode across South America. She was a woman ahead of her time, a woman who really sort of was a free spirit and did what she wanted. And in the end, you have to sort of admire her that she sort of lived life with her own rules.
Right. I mean, really fascinating. And picking up, paramours on the way, and he was away for his career for extended periods of time, correct?
Yes, I think it's because he was away that she began to play away herself. But I think also she had this need for love and validation. She'd had this rather sad upbringing. Her mother died when she was very young. She had a rather unpleasant stepmother. Her father was very busy as a member of parliament. And first of all, her love was sort of focused on animals. Later, say in her career, it was focused on children, though she wasn't the best mother to her own two daughters, one of whom is still alive in her 90s. But she was a most remarkable person. And I didn't find anyone who had a critical word to say about her, who I interviewed.
Right, and I think that he was involved in the admiralty and his naval career. I think when they got married, he was gone for 8 months at one point, and so there's a lot of correspondence between them both, right?
Yes, they were apart a lot, and she didn't like a lot of the postings he went to. She didn't like being the married, the life of a naval wife. And so, in some ways, it was very lonely. I mean, there are extraordinary elements in the book, bits of the book where he just sits on his own on Christmas Day, and she just did her own thing, and was quite self-centered, really, particularly pre-war. Just went off with her friends. She took lovers like the jazz musician Leslie Hutchinson, known as Hutch. She had an affair with Paul Robeson, the actor. So she by instance going across the racial bar with her love affairs, she also was ahead of her time in many respects.
And I think you mentioned, just sorry to interrupt, but you mentioned she came to New York and was very much involved or wanting to see the culture of Harlem and things like that. That was pretty
yes, they both
remarkable.
loved America. In fact, they had part of their honeymoon in America. They went off to see a baseball game with Babe Ruth. They knew Jerome Kern. They, in fact, made a film with Charlie Chaplin in Hollywood. They were very friendly with Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and Sr. and Mary Pickford. And they loved mixing with stars, everyone from Clark Gable through to Jane Mansfield. But America for them was a place of freedom where they could be themselves. They weren't members of the royal family or establishment figures. She had a particular love, as you say, of Harlem and the jazz players there. She also spent a lot of time in Paris with them. And they had a lot of friends in the States and spent quite a lot of time there. He, in fact, was at Pearl Harbor just before the bombing of Pearl Harbor and in fact advised the Americans that they should, for example, not put their aircraft out, make them so exposed that they should cover their communication signal cables and things like that. But alas, the advice wasn't picked up in time, and hence the disaster at Pearl Harbor. But they were, say, close to presidents from Roosevelt right through to Nixon.
And so in those interwar years between World War I and II, he was kind of ascending the hierarchy of the British Navy, correct?
Yes, I mean, he was always seen as a high flyer, and he had a special expertise in signals and intelligence. So he did a lot of work there. He taught signals, but he was clearly going to go to flag rank. And his career was really helped during the Second World War because Churchill became his great mentor. Churchill had in fact helped, in effect, sack his father as First Sea Lord during this anti-German feeling during the First World War. And I think he always felt guilty about that. And so he actually promoted Mountbatten from being a mere captain to being an admiral during the beginning of the Second World War, and put him in charge of combined operations. And these were the sort of landing parties that were sent into occupied Europe. A lot of the raids, for example, the famous Dieppe raid in 1942, in which so many Canadian soldiers were killed. But he really was catapulted to this position. I think he said he was the youngest admiral since Nelson. So Churchill really made him, and he then eventually became a member of the Chiefs of Staff, and then had this role in Southeast Asia, where he was working with MacArthur and Stilwell and others to basically see off the Japanese.
Right, and so the British Empire had holdings in the Southeast Asia, so he was involved in a lot of that part of the conflict in that arena, and that's kind of what led him to his next assignment, right? Which I think is a really incredibly
yes. I think it was because of the success he made of his job as Supreme Allied Commander, because he knew the area, that when Attlee came to power in 1945, and it was, he guaranteed Indian independence, he felt that Mountbatten would be a good choice. He knew the area, he knew the princes, the fact that he was part of the royal family would be attractive to them. He was very pragmatic. He was also a man of the left, really, and therefore very close to a lot of Labour ministers. And he was sent out in March 1947 to basically speed up independence. The realization was the Indians wouldn't be prepared to wait any longer. There was already quite a lot of communal violence, but his task really was to try and keep India together as a united India. But unfortunately, Jinnah, the Muslim leader of the Muslim League, was determined on having his own separate homeland, Pakistan. And as a result, we had the creation of these two countries. And it was done very, very quickly because of the pressure of this communal violence and the soundings that Mountbatten took there. So he was told that basically independence should come by June 1948. In fact, he pushed it forward to August 1947. And the result was that there've since then been a lot of criticism that he wasn't entirely impartial. He was too close to Nehru, too friendly with him, and that worked against the interests of Pakistan. And also that he rushed it, with the result that there wasn't proper provision for an orderly sort of changeover. And a lot of these communal tensions between the Muslims, the Hindus, and the Sikhs came to the surface. And there probably 1 million people were killed in the immediate aftermath of independence in August 1947. So a bit of a stain on his character there, but it's difficult to see given this existing communal violence, given the resources he had and the desire by the British to rid themselves of India as quickly as possible, that he could have done much else.
And it is there's an interesting part of the book where he has sit-downs with, like 1 hour sit-downs, Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah, trying to figure out how to resolve the issue. And there were other plans or other types of things that they had conceived other than just the separating India from Pakistan. So it was interesting to see how that came. And you can see those kind of conflicts in historiography of how it would have worked out. But like you said, and even at that time, there's just so many brutal murders and pillaging and things like that. I don't know how it could have been done peacefully, really.
Yeah, I mean, clearly with maybe a bit more preparation, but, the responsibility, I think, also lies with the Indian and Pakistan leaders who didn't really want the British to be involved. The British didn't want to lose lives, basically saving Indian and Pakistan lives, because they were out of it. And the Indians and Pakistan didn't want the British to be involved either. Now they're independent nations. So it is one of those things that just happened. But as you say, he worked very hard. He had this system called the Hive, where he would just get literally 3 or 4 people around a table and try and hammer out some solution. But there is a feeling that he was very close to Nehru. There's a suggestion that Edwina began her affair with Nehru even before independence, possibly in the spring of 1947, just after they arrived. And that, of course, hasn't played well with Pakistan, who felt that there was favoritism towards India, not least in some of the boundary arrangements, the way that, for example, headwaters were given to India, arsenals were given to India. So it is difficult because the man who was responsible for these boundary changes, called Cyril Radcliffe, only had about 6 weeks to do it. He had to make a lot of decisions on his own. He had very old maps, and the boundaries were very difficult to determine, because you had physical features, you had tribal allegiances, you had all sorts of things that just made it very difficult to know where to draw the line.
Right, and I mean, his involvement, like they were very impressed, at least in the book, with Gandhi and Nehru, and she had this affair with. He became the prime minister of India, right? So she had some type
Yes, yes. I mean, Nehru. It was clearly, well, in some ways, it was the most important relationship that Edwina had outside her marriage. She After she left India, and she was very tempted to stay in India afterwards, and there was talk of divorcing Dickie. She came back every spring and spent several months in India, and then he would come to Britain in the autumn and see her. They wrote sometimes 3 times a day, and there are hundreds of letters between them for the 20 years, really, between from 1947 to her death in 1960, so 13 years. And I've been trying very hard over the last 4 years to get access not only to the private diaries and letters of Dickie and Edwina, which were bought to be seen by the public by Southampton University here in Britain, but also to this Nehru-Edwina correspondence, which I think is a very important historical source, and which was bought by public funds here to be seen, but which has been closed for the last 10 years. And that campaign continues. We've just had a hearing which has had quite a lot of publicity here in Britain and also in India. And we've managed to get 99% of Dickie and Edwina's diaries and letters released. And it's now simply a matter of getting these literally hundreds of letters between Edwina and Nehru made publicly available.
And I mean, you said when she passed away, she was surrounded by these letters from him. So they had a very intimate kind of emotional tie. I mean, I think it's so much historical importance, because their political decisions were very personal, like on a very personal level, how they were making decisions for India at that time, right?
Yes, he was given delegated quite a lot of authority, because, of course, it was a long way away, and decisions had to be made quickly. So he had a lot of independence, and that's, I suppose, where some of the criticism has come, that there were no checks on him. But it is a great love story. As you say, she died of this heart attack, but she's clearly been reading Nehru's letters as she was in bed when she had it. And it's a fantastic sort of Netflix series, because it takes you from the sort of high life of Paris and the south of France and Long Island and Palm Beach, through war-torn Britain and Europe and Southeast Asia, through to India, and then through to their life after the war, when he was still very involved with the royal family and indeed with British politics. And there are lots of controversies in his career, not least his involvement in a coup, potential involvement in a coup in 1968 against the British government. So it was a very full and varied life. And at the center is this extraordinary love affair between 2 people who I think clearly are in love with each other, but have these separate affairs with other people.
Right. I mean, it had. I mean, she was involved with Bill Paley, or he's very well known here in the States. William Paley, founder of CBS. So she.
Absolutely, yes, exactly. No, there were lots of American lovers. And Bill Paley, yes, was probably, as you say, one of the best known.
Yeah. So, and so, but also kind of this life of very sophistication, but also a lot of privilege and wealth and mansions all over the place. They're installed in these huge, estates all over the world, really, right? Even in India.
Yes, I mean they had a huge townhouse in London, which on Park Lane, which she'd inherited from her grandfather, who was probably the richest man in the world at the time. So think, Paul Getty and the Walworth fortune. And then they actually pulled that down and built a block of flats and had a huge penthouse which looked out over Hyde Park. They could entertain sort of several hundred people for drinks. They had these huge terraces that went round that could take again hundreds of people. They often entertained sort of 60 people for dinner. They then had a huge estate down in south of London, which had been owned by Palmerston, the former prime minister, where they had horses and again entertained everyone from prime ministers to film stars. He was very friendly with Grace Kelly, and in fact had an affair with Shirley MacLaine after Edwina died, which Shirley MacLaine has never talked about publicly. But I was able to interview one of the valets who was working there in the 1960s, who talks about her as the sort of chatelaine there and how popular she was as a figure, as his hostess.
So yeah, and so can you talk like in the post-war? There's a lot of involvement with the royal family and also intrigue. Can you kind of talk about his post-war kind of career?
Yes, I mean he becomes when the Queen comes to the throne in 1953. I mean she's a very young woman, and so she relies on people like Dickie for advice. I mean by this stage he's had these very important roles. He's come back from India. He's heading to become basically head of the Navy. And so she does take advice from him. He has a lot of influence because Prince Philip is his nephew. And in fact, he very much encouraged the marriage of Prince Philip and the Queen. And he'd been very close to the Queen's father, George VI. They'd been at Cambridge together. And he'd shifted his allegiance from Edward VIII after he abdicated to George VI, but she'd known him basically all her life, the Queen. So she relied on him for advice. But I think in some ways, the person who he became the greatest mentor to was Prince Charles, who called him his honorary grandfather. And Charles, whose father perhaps was too busy to show much interest in him, relied on Mountbatten. Mountbatten saw a role for himself there in creating the future king. Charles, for example, had a room in the country house in Hampshire, south of London, that he could bring girlfriends to. He spent a lot of time with Mountbatten, and Mountbatten was an important influence on him. And I think one of the questions is if Mountbatten had lived beyond 1979, he's murdered by the IRA. Then one wonders whether Charles would have married Diana or married someone else, and the history might have been very different. So, he was a sort of a paternal figure to certainly three generations of the royal family, and possibly even further back than that.
And can you kind of talk about the troubles? Americans may not be as familiar as people in the UK about the background and the IRA and what led up to his assassination.
Yes, I mean the Irish Republican Army was campaigning in Ireland for an independent Ireland. They wanted united Ireland, joining the Northern Ireland, which was part of the UK, and Southern Ireland, which was independent. And particularly from about 1968 and through to really into this century, there was, and indeed up to the present day, there was incredible violence, particularly in Belfast, but really throughout Ireland, from the IRA. Many soldiers were killed. They would kidnap and murder prominent individuals, judges, and members of the armed forces in Ireland. And in fact, the royal family were banned from going to Ireland. But Mountbatten had a country, a sort of holiday home on the west coast of Ireland. He went there every summer, often against official advice, but he had quite extensive police protection. Now, in 1979, the Troubles were at their particularly bad stage. The close advisor to Margaret Thatcher, called Nehru, who was the Secretary of State for Ireland, had been assassinated in the House of Commons. And indeed, there had been an attempt, I think, on General Haig at the same time. And he was warned not to go to Ireland that summer, but he insisted on going and taking his family, as he always did. The extraordinary thing is that instead of security being increased because of the enhanced threat, it was actually reduced. And I talked to one of the people who did the security audit for the visit, who said that he warned about the vulnerabilities, one of which was his boat, which was kept in the harbour, but often literally docked on the quayside, which he said could have had a bomb placed on it and then remotely activated. There had actually been a very similar attempt to this the previous year. And for some strange reason, the boat was not guarded in 1979, and that's exactly what happened. A bomb was placed on it. The next day, Mountbatten went out with his grandchildren and his daughter, and the boat was blown up. Mountbatten, his son-in-law's mother, his grandson, and one of the boys on the boat, a friend of the grandson, were all killed. And it was a great coup for the IRA that they managed to kill a member of the royal family. But there are lots of questions about why security wasn't better that day, suggestions that perhaps it suited people's purposes that he died, or that there was some cock-up, that there was some perhaps leak, that the security audit that was given by this British military policeman was passed back to the Gardaí, who were the Irish police, who passed it on to the IRA. So there are a lot of mysteries in his life. And one of the other mysteries I found, or one of the other strange things I found, was an FBI file from the Second World War showing that he had a predilection for young boys. He was a paedophile. And the FBI actually had opened a file on him and on Edwina for her communist views. Unfortunately, many of those files are now destroyed, but they give some indication of the secret life that he had as a bisexual, with a series of affairs with young military personnel, but also the fact that he was abusing teenage boys. In fact, I interviewed two boys who claimed to have been abused by him in the summer of 1977. So there's a darker side to the Mountbatten story than just this life of pomp and public show. And I think there are probably still parts of the story to be revealed. But clearly, there's been a great attempt to cover it up. No one, of course, wants the embarrassment of the Queen's uncle, in fact, being found to be an abuser of young children.
And I mean, was there any other stories in that FBI file that, I mean, these are young teenage boys that was his predilection? Is that correct?
Well, the FBI file was an interview with a woman who gave them stories about his predilections. But there are quite a lot of accounts elsewhere to corroborate it. His driver in the Second World War, a man called Norman Neild, wrote an article about taking him to see, being taken to see young children to abuse them during the war. He wrote that article in the 1980s. And I then interviewed other people who worked with Mountbatten, for example, his military secretary and his ADC, who again told me stories of young children, boys being brought to him, mainly teenagers, really. And even when he was at NATO, boys being sent up into the lift to his private apartment. But this was an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do. It opened them up to blackmail. It was a criminal offense, homosexuality, in this country until 1967. And indeed, you were thrown out of the Navy if you were homosexual until 2000. So for a man who was very ambitious, it was extraordinary that his career was protected by people. And that's certainly the case. I interviewed his chauffeur from 1947 1948 in Malta, who's still alive in his 90s. And he said that he was told to find out where the male brothel was in Malta because Mountbatten would want to be taken there. So there are some very, very dark undertones to his life. One of the things I found was that really there have only been authorized books on the couple, that the family have been very protective of the material. They've only released it to favored biographers that will tell the story in the way they want it. And so it was quite a battle to try and tell the story independently. There are quite a lot of papers now in the public domain from the family. He kept everything from his school reports at the age of 5 to the household accounts. But there has been also quite widespread weeding of his papers. But fortunately, there is stuff, for example, in the States and elsewhere. There's even a suggestion, I was talking to a Russian journalist, that in fact, because of these activities, he was open to blackmail, and he was recruited as a Russian agent with the code name Admiral. Now, there's no corroboration for that. That may be disinformation. But if so, that is an extraordinary story, given that he was the man in charge of the Navy.
It really is. I mean, how was this received in the UK? I mean, is this accepted now, or do they not want to talk about it? I mean, how was
the book, when it was published originally in the UK in 2019, went straight into the bestseller lists. It was a top 10 bestseller. It's had widespread review coverage. Buckingham Palace refused to comment on it. The family tried to downplay the revelations. But the fact is, these revelations are all based on extensive primary research on not just FBI files and testimony from people, but other papers from other collections, government files. So it's very hard to undermine what I found. And I think there have been lots of rumors about his sexual activities in magazines, but there hadn't been really any proof. And what the FBI file and some of the testimony really did was to put bones on the whole story.
Do you find any evidence that Edwina knew of his tendencies?
I've not seen any evidence that she knew, but I think it's highly likely that she did. What I have found is in the letters between them that have been made available, and this campaign to get the letters and diaries released led to 99% of the diaries and letters being released, but not the Nehru correspondence, is she wrote to him about his riding complex. This riding complex, he got a basic sexual thrill from women in jodhpurs and riding boots, particularly riding, and he would ride behind them and look at them. And he had a particular thing about his elder daughter, Patricia. And Edwina got very upset about this and actually forbade him from riding with his daughter. So he had these, I wouldn't say incestuous feelings towards his daughter, but these sexual feelings were aroused by watching his daughter on riding a horse ahead of him. So he had a lot of very strange kinks. And he used to ride, for example, with a condom because he got so excited. So it does bring another sort of side to it. And there were a whole series of slightly unusual sexual practices that he had that sort of the family clearly didn't want to come out.
Yeah, it's really wild. I mean, they were like an open marriage type relationship. He had to know about all of her, what do you say, 15, 16, 17 different paramours or lovers, right? I mean,
yes, he was not. I mean, it was very interesting. He wasn't jealous of her lovers. In fact, he became friendly with them. One of her lovers, a long-term lovers, was a man called Bunny Phillips, who was on his staff in Southeast Asia. And whilst Bunny was on the staff with Mountbatten, they shared the same female lover, a woman called Janie Lindsay, who was an extraordinary woman. She had been proposed to by two men in her life, J.F. Kennedy and David Niven, and she turned both of them down. And she came quite close to marrying Mountbatten at the end of the war when Edwina threatened divorce. So there they were sharing Janie Lindsay, while Bunny was the lover of Edwina at the same time. So there was a sort of foursome there. And that again happened with Lord Beaverbrook, who had a mistress called Jean Norton, who was Edwina's best friend. and who also seemed to be the lover of Mountbatten, while Beaverbrook was the lover of Edwina. So they kind of swapped partners. It was the swinging 60s and the 1940s. But he was fine about her lovers. She was desperately jealous of his lovers. He had a long-term lover called Yola Letellier, who was supposedly the inspiration for Gigi, who was much younger than him, a French woman who'd been married to a well-known French proprietor and businessman called Henri Letellier. And that affair went on for about 60 years. But Edwina would try and sneak her away on holiday whenever Dickie was coming on shore leave from the Navy, to just prevent him from going away with her. And sometimes she could be seen looking through the keyhole of their bedroom just to see what they were up to. So she was a bit of a hypocrite, really. She was allowed to behave in one way, but poor old Dickie wasn't.
Yeah, I know, it's interesting. And they had an interesting relationship with themselves and their children, too. She seemed to not be as much of a hands-on mother.
No, she wasn't. I mean, again, it's extraordinary. She, like a lot of people, I suppose, she was good with other people's children, but not with her own. And the daughters tell these rather poignant stories of hearing their mother come up to the nursery early evening, hoping she's going to come in and see them. And she pauses and walks on by to her room. Whereas Dickie was always there reading to them. She had a lot of interest. I mean, often Edwina was away traveling. He was, in a sense, the only parent. He was a single parent. And there is this rather extraordinary letter that Dickie wrote to Patricia. Pamela, the younger daughter, in which he says to her, "I only really love you because you're Patricia's sister. As you know, I have a particular bond with her." And it's a very strange letter to write to your daughter, saying that you have a preference for one of the two sisters. So it was a very strange sort of operation. Indeed, it carried on in the next generation. Pamela married a well-known interior designer called David Hicks, who's quite well known in the States, but who was also bisexual. And there was, in effect, a ménage à trois there. So they were used to these unorthodox, I suppose, marital arrangements, and just carried them on. But it is fascinating to see the connections with the States. Dickie was very friendly with a woman who was part of the Doubleday publishing family, in fact, called Rona Doubleday, who'd hoped to marry him after Edwina died. He often stayed with Christina Ford, who he's rather attracted to, and was very friendly with Henry Ford. So they had a lot of American connections and spent a lot of time in New York.
Right. And then just like them being part of the history is really incredible, too. These very ornate Byzantine personal relationships, but there they are, World War II, last and final Viceroy of India, the Troubles, like an advisor to Prince of Wales, the future king, just really incredible places that they were in, and a great book and a great discussion as well. Where's the best place for people to get the Mountbattens?
Well, the book was published by Pegasus in September. It's available on Amazon. It should be in bookshops if they want to buy it. So I think it's just a matter of Googling it or asking in your local bookshop. But I'm very hopeful that there've been now 3 documentaries based on the book, and I'm very hopeful that it will be turned into a drama series. So because it is such an extraordinary story, and they are such, I suppose, larger than life figures. She also had an affair with quite a well-known composer and musician here. So I mean, they just mixed with the most important, amazing people. I mean, they were very close, for example, to Princess Grace of Monaco. Dickie was, in effect, wanted to have an affair with her, but she kept bringing Prince Rainier whenever he invited her to stay. So he never got his wicked way, unfortunately.
Interesting. And where's you have a website too, right, Andrew?
Yes. I mean, people can just Google me, Andrew Lownie, Lownie, and that will bring up my literary agency website, which has contact numbers. I'm also on Facebook and on Twitter and on LinkedIn if people want to reach me that way. And if they Google me, they will find, for example, there's a PowerPoint presentation that I do on the Mountbattens and on, indeed, the more recent book, The Traitor King, which is available online. There are a lot of articles and reviews online now, so that there's quite a lot of information there for those who are interested.
Right, and your website is your full name, Andrew Lownie, LOWNIE.co.uk, so you can see his literary agent and contact information, and his social media links are there as well. But thank you so much for your time. Again, the title of the book is The Mountbattens, The Lives and Loves of Dickie and Edwina Mountbatten, published here in the States September 7th, 2021. Thanks so much. All right. You still there?
I'm still here. That was
Okay.
great. Thank you
All right,
so
cool.